These were the Ainu, the first people of the far north of Japan, and to the visitors who stumbled upon them, they looked like no one else on Earth. Lighter-skinned, round-eyed, with thick wavy hair, and a presence that did not fit any map the outsiders carried. Their world was a hard and beautiful one, an island of drift ice and black sand shores, of rivers that boiled silver each autumn with returning salmon, and forests where the brown bear walked like a king through the fog. And in this world, the Ainu believed something extraordinary. They believed that everything around them was alive. The fire, the river, the mountains, even the knife in a hunter's hand. Each one a god, wearing a disguise, visiting the world of humans for a little while. The greatest god of all came in the body of a bear. They raised its cub as one of their own children. They fed it, sang to it, loved it. And then, in grief and gratitude, they sent its spirit home. But this world did not last. From the south came settlers the Ainu called Wajin, the ones who cannot be trusted. With them came trade, and debt, and disease. And slowly, a way of life that had endured for thousands of years began to come apart. Their language was banned, their hunts forbidden, the blue tattoos outlawed. Even their name for themselves, Ainu, meaning simply human, was pushed into the shadows. A whole people told to disappear. And yet, the fire never fully went out. So who were the Ainu, the people of the gods? How did they live? What did they believe? And how, against everything, did they survive? This is their story. Go to the very top of Japan, past the cities, past the rice fields, past the warm southern coasts. Keep going until the land turns wild and the air turns sharp. Here, at the edge of the world, lies Hokkaido. The wind here does not whisper. It arrives off the Sea of Okhotsk like a fist, carrying cold so deep it seems to reach inside you. It pulls at the trees, it scours the shore. And in the dead of winter, it brings something stranger still. Out on the horizon, the sea begins to freeze. Great plates of drift ice crowd in toward the land, grinding against one another with a low, groaning roar, a sound like the whole ocean shifting in its sleep. By morning, the water itself has turned to white stone. The beaches are not golden but black, fine volcanic sand, scattered with bleached driftwood. Stand on them in winter and you hear almost nothing. Only the ice, only the wind. A silence so total it feels like the land is holding its breath. Turn inland and the world changes again. Forests of birch and elm rise out of the snow, their bare branches dusted white, standing perfectly still. Walk among them and your footsteps vanish into the soft hush. This is a cathedral with no walls. These trees were everything. The elm gave its inner bark to be spun into clothing. The birch gave bark and firewood. To the people who lived here, the forest was not scenery. It was a pantry, a workshop, and a living companion, all at once. Beyond the forest, the mountains wait. Some are gentle and green, but others are not asleep. They smoke, they steam. The ground beneath them is restless, and the air around them carries the sharp, eggy bite of sulfur on the wind. In places, the earth itself seems alive. Hot springs bubble up through the rock. Steam curls from cracks in the ground as if the land were breathing. It is beautiful, and it is a reminder that here, nature is never tame and never quite still. And in that fog moved the master of these forests, the brown bear, huge, silent, unhurried. It could appear at the tree line like a shadow given weight, then melt away before you drew a breath. To meet it was to feel very small and very mortal. For half the year this land could kill. Deep snow buried the trails. Cold pressed against every wall. A bad winter meant hunger, and hunger meant death. Survival here was never promised. It had to be earned, season by season. But then, the thaw. The ice on the rivers cracks and lets go. Water roars free again. Green pushes up through the melting snow almost overnight, as if the land has been waiting, holding all that life in reserve. Summer is short and blazing. For a few brief weeks, the hills turn a green so vivid it almost hurts the eyes. Wildflowers spill across the meadows. The whole island seems to exhale and live as hard and fast as it can before the cold returns. And then, in autumn, the rivers gave their greatest gift. Salmon, thousands upon thousands of them, surging upstream until the water itself seemed to turn silver and churn. The land had taken so much. Now, for a while, it gave it all back. To understand the Ainu, we have to go back. Not hundreds of years, thousands. Long before Japan was Japan, long before the first rice field was planted in the south, people were already living here, in this cold and beautiful north. Their ancestors are known to us as the Jomon. They were among the oldest peoples on earth to make pottery, shaping clay by hand more than 10,000 years ago. They did not build empires. They did not need to. The land provided. They were hunters and gatherers. They followed the deer through the forests, pulled salmon from the rivers, and read the seasons like a book they had memorized over 100 generations. They lived not against nature, but inside it. In the far south of these islands, the world was changing fast. New people, new tools, new ways of farming arrived from the Asian mainland. But up here in the north, the old ways held on. The cold kept them. The isolation protected them. Then, across the northern sea, new people came. The Okhotsk, fierce sea hunters from the cold coasts of Sakhalin and the Amur River. They hunted seals and whales. They worshipped the bear. And they brought their blood, their gods, and their ways into the north. And from within the island itself rose another people, the Satsumon, who worked iron and tilled small gardens. Slowly, over centuries, these streams of people flowed together. The ancient Jomon, the seafaring Okhotsk, the settled Satsumon, and from that mingling, something entirely new was born. By around 800 years ago, a distinct people had taken shape across this northern world. They called themselves by a single powerful word, Ainu. And in their own language, that word meant simply human. Theirs was a language like no other on earth. It was not Japanese. It belonged to no great family of tongues. It stood alone, its own world of words for its own world of gods, rivers, and seasons, carried entirely by memory, never written down. Their world stretched far. Across the whole of the northern island they called home. North onto Sakhalin, east along the chain of the Kuril Islands. Wherever the rivers ran with salmon and the forests held game, the Ainu made their villages. For centuries they lived largely as they pleased, hunting, fishing, and trading with peoples to the north and the south. They were not isolated savages, as outsiders would later claim. They were skilled traders, moving furs and eagle feathers and dried fish across vast distances. But to the south, a different people were growing in number and in power. The Ainu had a name for these newcomers from the south. They called them Wajin, and the meaning carried a warning. It meant the people who cannot be trusted. At first, the trade seemed fair. The Ainu brought furs, dried salmon, and the prized feathers of the eagle. In return came iron tools, lacquered bowls, rice, and cloth. Two worlds met at the water's edge, each with something the other wanted. But trade is never just trade. Slowly, the balance tipped. The Wajin merchants began to set the terms. How much a basket of salmon was worth, how much a fur would buy. And bit by bit, the Ainu found themselves caught in webs of debt they could not escape. Then came something far worse than debt: disease. Smallpox, carried north by the newcomers, swept through the villages like fire through dry grass. The Ainu had no defense against it. Whole communities sickened. Whole families were lost in a single season. A powerful clan from the south, the Matsumai, seized control of all trade with the Ainu. They built their posts along the coast and grew rich on Ainu labor and Ainu goods. And among the Ainu, beneath the surface, a deep anger began to grow. That anger first broke into the open long ago, in the year 1457. A chieftain named Koshamain rose up after a quarrel turned deadly, and led his people in attacks on a dozen Japanese forts along the coast. The uprising was crushed, Koshamain was killed, and the forts held. But the message was clear. The Ainu would not simply fade away. They would fight for their world, and the greatest fight of all was still to come. 2 centuries passed. The pressure never eased. And then, in 1669, a leader emerged whose name the Ainu would never forget. His name was Shakushain, and he would become the symbol of his people's fight to remain free. It began, as these things often do, close to home, a bitter feud between Ainu groups over hunting grounds and fishing rivers. But the Wajin saw a chance to deepen their grip, and the quarrel spilled outward into something far larger. Then word spread of a terrible betrayal. Ainu messengers had died of disease while in Wajin hands, and the rumor took hold that they had been poisoned. Grief turned to fury. And Shakushain did something rare. He called on all the Ainu to rise together as one. For a moment, the scattered villages became something they had almost never been, a single force. They struck at the trading boats and the coastal posts. The uprising spread across the land, and for a brief, fierce season, the Ainu held the upper hand. But the Matsumai had something the Ainu did not: guns. They struck back hard, and the tide turned against the rebellion. Worn down and outmatched, Shakushain finally agreed to lay down arms and make peace. He was invited to a banquet to seal it. That banquet was a trap. Shakushain was murdered as he sat in peace. With his death, the last great hope of Ainu freedom was broken. The forts multiplied, the grip tightened, and a long, painful chapter, one that would nearly erase them, was about to begin. Now leave the wars and the history behind. Step into an ordinary morning, in an ordinary village, in a world that ran on rhythms far older than any empire. The sky is just beginning to pale, and inside a small thatched house, the day is already starting. At the heart of every home burned a fire. Not just any fire, a sacred one. The Ainu believed a goddess lived within those flames. Her name was Kamui, the grandmother of the hearth. And her fire was never, ever allowed to die. So the first task of the day belonged to the woman of the house. Before anything else, she knelt at the hearth, fed it fresh wood, and coaxed the embers back to life. Warmth returned to the room, and with it, the day could truly begin. The house itself was a single large room, no walls inside to divide it. The hearth sat at the center, sunken into the earthen floor. There was no chimney, just a gap in the thatch high above, where the smoke drifted slowly up and out into the morning. On the eastern wall sat a special window. The Ainu called it the God's window. Through it, they believed, the spirits came and went. No human was ever to peer in through it, or pass anything ordinary across it. It was a doorway, but not for people. Inside, everyone had their place. The fire had a head and sides, like a small kingdom of its own. The husband and wife sat together to one side of it. Guests were seated according to honor. Even sitting down, the Ainu world had its quiet order. There was little furniture. Thick woven mats covered the floor, soft beneath bare feet. Tools and clothing hung from the walls and rafters. Everything had its hook, its corner, its purpose. In a single room shared by a whole family, nothing could afford to be wasted. Step outside, and the village stretched along the river. The houses all faced the same way, lined up east to west, each one turned to greet the rising sun and its sacred window. The Ainu called such a village a Kotan, a handful of families, one shared world. Beside the houses stood the storehouses, small huts raised high on wooden legs. Up there, Safe above the damp ground and out of reach of hungry animals, the village kept its dried fish, its grain, its winter survival. To raid one was to threaten everyone. As the sun cleared the trees, the men prepared to leave. The river and the forest were calling. Some took up spears and bows for the hunt. Others gathered nets and traps for the salmon. And every one of them carried, at his side, the most useful tool he owned. It was the makiri, a small knife with a beautifully carved wooden handle and sheath. The Ainu used it for everything: skinning game, carving wood, preparing food. A man's makiri was personal, often decorated by his own hand, and almost never out of reach. Down at the river, the men set to work. They built clever weirs and traps across the current, channels that guided the fish into waiting nets. It was patient, cold, wet labor. But when the salmon were running, a good day could feed a family for weeks. But while the men were at the river, another kind of work was unfolding back in the village. Slower, quieter, and just as vital. This was the women's domain, and the greatest of their labors was the making of cloth. It began in spring, out among the elm trees. Strips of bark were carefully peeled away, but never too much, so the tree could live on. The forest gave its skin to clothe the people, and the people, in return, were careful never to take more than their share. Back home, the work of separating began. The rough outer bark was stripped away from the soft, pale inner layer. It was that inner bark, fine and golden, that held the magic. From it would come thread, and from thread, an entire robe. The inner bark was soaked in water for days until the fibers loosened and softened. Then it was peeled apart, again and again, into ever finer strands. Patience was not a virtue here. It was a requirement. The cloth could not be rushed. Then came the spinning. Long fingers twisted the strands into a single continuous thread, winding it carefully into balls. Hour after hour, day after day. A grandmother might do this work while a granddaughter watched, learning the rhythm with her eyes before she ever held the fiber herself. At last, the thread met the loom. A simple frame anchored to the body worked back and forth by hand. Slowly, row by row, the golden cloth grew. This fabric had a name, Attush, and it was the signature dress of the Ainu people. Think of what that meant. A single fine robe could take the better part of a year to make. From the spring peeling of the bark to the final stitch, months and months of labor, all for one garment. To wear Attush was to wear a whole season of someone's love. And the work was not done when the weaving ended. Now came the decoration. Bold, dark patterns sewn and stitched around the collar, the cuffs, the hem. These were not just for beauty. They were placed exactly where evil spirits might try to slip inside the body. Each pattern carried meaning. A swirl to protect. A thorn shape, like an arrow, to drive away harm. And these designs were never copied from a book. They lived in memory, passed from mother to daughter, hand to hand, down through the long line of women who came before. All the while, the children of the village were everywhere underfoot. They learned not from lessons, but from watching. How to hold a knife, how to twist a thread, how to read the river. By the time a task became theirs, they had already seen it 1,000 times. There were small chores for small hands, carrying water up from the river, gathering fallen branches for the fire, minding the youngest ones. In a Kotan, even a child of 5 had a part to play. The village was a single living body, and everyone was a piece of it. And then there were the elders. In a world without writing, the old were the library. They held the songs, the stories, the names of the gods, the memory of every flood and famine. To sit with an elder was to sit with the entire past of the people. By midday, the household paused to eat. The meal was simple: a hot soup from the pot over the fire, a little dried fish, whatever the season offered. But before a single mouthful was taken, an offering was given to the fire goddess. Gratitude came first. Always. In the afternoon, the mending began. Salmon skin boots, worn thin by the trails, were patched and resewn. The Ainu wasted nothing. Even the skin of a fish became footwear, light and tough, perfect for the snow. Every part of every creature found a second life. The men, too, had their handwork. With the same knives they carried all day, they carved. Bowls and trays from pale wood, decorated with flowing patterns, handles for their tools, and slender prayer sticks, curled and shaved, for the gods. To carve well was a mark of a good man. All of this, the fishing, the weaving, the carving, the gathering, followed the turning of the seasons. Spring for bark and planting, summer for foraging, autumn for the great salmon run, and winter for staying close, mending and waiting. The calendar was written in the land itself. Winter was the hardest test. Snow rose against the walls. The cold pressed in from every side, and the fire, Kamui Fuchi's fire, became the entire world, its light, its warmth, its smoke curing the thatch overhead. A family lived, quite literally, gathered around a goddess. And there, beside them, often lay a dog, loyal companions the Ainu kept for the hunt and for hauling loads across the snow. In the long, dark months, the boundary between human and animal, between family and fellow creature, grew very thin indeed. As darkness fell, the work was set aside. The family drew close to the fire, and one of the elders would begin to speak, or rather to sing. For the Ainu did not simply tell their stories. They chanted them in long, hypnotic epics called yukar. The children's eyes grew heavy. The fire burned low and was carefully banked so its goddess would survive the night. Tomorrow it would rise again with the sun, and so would they. This was daily life among the Ainu, simple on its surface, and yet holding an entire universe within it. For the Ainu, food was never just fuel. Every meal was a conversation with the land, a gift given, and a gift returned. To eat was to take part in something sacred, and to survive a northern winter, a family had to understand that conversation perfectly. The Ainu were hunters and gatherers. They had no single staple crop, no endless rice fields. Instead, their table was filled by the forest, the river, and the sea, each in its own season, each demanding its own patience and skill. But one creature stood above all others on their table, the salmon. They did not call it merely a fish. They called it Kamui Chep, the divine fish. Each autumn it returned to them in numbers beyond counting, and the whole year turned on its arrival. When the run came, the men were ready. They had built their weirs across the river, fences and channels woven from wood that funneled the surging fish into a narrow trap. There, in the cold rushing water, the harvest began. They took the fish with spears and special hooked clubs, working fast in the freezing current. But even here, there was reverence. The first salmon of the season was honored, welcomed almost as a guest, with thanks given for its return. Beyond the river lay the forest, and there the men hunted deer. Moving quietly through the birch and the snow, they tracked the herds across the hills, returning with meat that would be dried and stored for the lean months ahead. And then there was the greatest hunt of all, the bear. To face one was to face a god in the flesh, and to risk everything. The Ainu hunted the bear with deep respect and deeper fear, knowing that the animal could take a man's life as easily as he took the bear's. Their weapons held a hidden secret. The Ainu tipped their arrows with a poison made from the root of the aconite plant, a toxin so powerful that a single well-placed shot could bring down even the largest game. It was a craft known only to skilled hands. But every hunt was more than a hunt. When an animal fell, the Ainu thanked its spirit for the gift of its body. They believed the creature had chosen to come to them, and that treating it with honor would bring it, and its kind, back again. While the men hunted, the women fed the village in a different way. Through the spring and summer, they walked the forests and meadows, baskets in hand, gathering the wild bounty that the men's spears could never provide. They knew every edible plant by name and by season. Wild leek, pungent and powerful, pulled from the damp spring earth. Young ferns, uncurling green. The bulbs of mountain lilies, each one a thread in the web of survival, gathered at exactly the right moment. They tended small gardens, too, coaxing millet and other hardy grains from the short northern summer. And in autumn, they gathered nuts and small dark berries from the trees, some for food, some used as gentle medicine for the aches of the body. One thing set the Ainu apart from their neighbors to the south. They almost never ate their fish or meat raw. Where the Japanese prized the fresh slice, the Ainu cooked, boiling, drying, smoking. To them, the fire transformed food into something safe, warm, and whole. And then came the great work of the autumn: preservation. The salmon harvest was too vast to eat at once, and the winter was too long to go unprepared. So the fish were split open and hung in the cold wind to dry, row upon row, until they were hard as wood. More fish and strips of meat were hung above the hearth, where the rising smoke cured them slowly over days. The whole house filled with that rich, smoky scent. And as the storehouse on its stilts grew full, the family could finally breathe. They would make it through the cold. Now, let us watch a single dish come to life. The heart of Ainu cooking, the meal eaten in every home, in every season. It is a soup called chepoha, salmon soup, and making it well was one of the great arts of an Ainu woman. It begins with the salmon, brought in fresh and silver from the river. Nothing will be wasted. The fine cuts of flesh, the head, the soft inner parts, all of it has a role to play. The woman lays the fish on a round wooden cutting board, worn smooth by years of use. Then comes a sound that has echoed through Ainu homes for centuries. With a heavy, sharp blade, she begins to pound, chopping the salmon head and the softer pieces against the board again and again until the flesh and bone break down into a rough, rich mince. This pounded mixture has a name, sitatap, which means simply that which we pound. The rhythm of the blade is steady and sure, a sound as familiar in the Kotan as the crackle of the fire itself. It is hard work, and it is hers. Into the sitatap she works finely chopped wild leek, the same pungent green her hands gathered in the spring, a little dried kelp from the sea, crushed for its deep, savory flavor, and a pinch of salt. That is all. The flavors are bold, but they are honest. Notice what is missing. There is no soy sauce here, no fermented bean paste, the seasonings that flavor the food of the South. The Ainu kitchen had its own language entirely, built from fish, from kelp, from wild herbs, and from the clean taste of the land itself. Meanwhile, over the fire, the broth has been building. Bones and small dried fish were set to heat in water, slowly giving up their richness. A strip of kelp deepens the stock further. There are no exact measurements. Only the knowing hands of a woman who has made this 1,000 times. Now the chunks of fresh salmon go in, lowered gently into the simmering broth. After them, the wild vegetables of the season, fern shoots, mountain greens, whatever the forest has offered. The soup thickens, the colors deepen. The aroma begins to fill the dark, warm room. As it cooks, a pale foam rises to the surface. A southern cook might skim it away, but not here. The Ainu left the foam exactly where it was, for they believed it carried the soup's healing power, the strength of the river gathered into the pot. Finally, the richest touch of all, a measure of animal or fish fat, stirred in to finish the soup. It melts across the surface, golden and glistening, giving the broth a deep, satisfying warmth that would line the belly against the coming cold. The soup is ready, but no one reaches for a bowl just yet. First, the woman turns to the fire, to Kamui Fuchi, the grandmother of the hearth. A small offering is given to the flames. The very first taste of the meal belongs to the goddess who made the cooking possible. Only then is the soup shared, ladled steaming into wooden bowls and passed around the hearth. A simple dish, but look closely, and you will see the whole landscape in it. The river's salmon, the forest's greens, the sea's kelp, an entire world gathered into a single warm bowl. The Ainu built no kingdoms, crowned no emperors. Their world rested on something smaller and stronger, the family and the village of families. To understand how they lived, you have to understand how they belonged to one another. Several generations often shared a single home, grandparents, parents, and children, all gathered around the same sacred fire. The young learned from the old simply by living beside them. The household was a school, a workshop, and a sanctuary, all at once. But the Ainu family held a remarkable secret in how it traced its bloodline. Belonging passed down two separate paths at once, one for the men and one entirely hidden for the women. Two threads of identity, woven through every person. From the father's side, sons inherited a set of secret marks, small symbols known to the family, used to sign hunting grounds and sacred tools. These crests said, without words, "This man comes from this line, and these are his people." From the mother's side came something far more intimate. It was passed from mother to daughter, and no man was ever permitted to see it. A woven cord, worn secretly beneath the robe, against the body. The Ainu called it the upsorkut, the hidden girdle. Each girdle was braided in a pattern unique to a woman's female line, 3 cords, or 5, or 7, woven just so. And those patterns echoed the tattoos on her arms. Together, the secret cord and the visible ink were said to hold a woman's soul strength. A child became an adult at around 15 or 16. For a boy, it meant dressing his hair as a man for the first time, and taking up a man's responsibilities at the river and in the forest. He was no longer a child to be minded, but a provider. For a girl, adulthood was marked most visibly upon her face. The lip tattoo, begun in childhood, was completed at last. The wide blue band finished, cut and inked stroke by stroke. With it came her secret girdle. Now, by the customs of her people, she was ready for marriage. Courtship was a quiet, careful thing, and it was carried out through gifts. A young man who admired a woman would send her tokens of his skill. A small knife, carved by his own hand. A finely made workbox. Each one whispered the same message: "I can provide for you." If she favored him, she answered in kind, with gifts of her own making. Embroidered clothing, coverings for the backs of his hands, leggings stitched with her patterns. Her reply said just as clearly, "And I can make a home." The whole courtship was a quiet exchange of proof. The marriage itself was simple. No grand ceremony, no display of wealth. Soon after, the couple would build a small house of their own, often added onto the family home. A new fire was lit, a new hearth goddess welcomed, and a new household began its life. Each village had a leader, the Kotan Korkuru, the one who held the village. But he was no ruler in the way the South understood it. He led by wisdom and by respect. His home served as the meeting place, and his voice carried weight only as long as the people trusted it. He settled quarrels, led the great ceremonies, and spoke for his village to outsiders. Yet he ate the same food and wore the same cloth as everyone else. Among the Ainu, no one grew fat while his neighbors starved. What a village had, a village shared. For status here was not measured in possessions. It was measured in skill, in generosity, in wisdom. A great hunter, a gifted weaver, a fair and thoughtful elder. These were the people held highest. And above them all stood the keepers of memory, the old. So this was Ainu society, bound not by crowns or armies, but by respect, by reciprocity, and by the patient passing of knowledge from old hands to young. A people held together by the simple, powerful belief that everyone belonged, and everyone mattered. A people can be defined by what they hunt and what they eat. But the deepest truth of who they are lives somewhere else, in their art, their music, their stories, and the marks they choose to carry on their own skin. This is the soul of the Ainu. Remember, the Ainu had no written language. They could not record who they were in books or letters. So instead, they poured their identity into three things: the wood they carved, the cloth they stitched, and the songs they kept alive in memory. Their culture was something you could hold, hear, and wear. Let us begin with the men's great art, carving. With the same small knife he carried everywhere, an Ainu man could turn a plain block of wood into something extraordinary. It was a skill that marked a good husband, a respected elder, a man of patience and care. His most famous creations were the carved trays, flat wooden platters covered edge to edge in flowing, interlocking patterns. The work was so fine, so distinctive, that it became known across all of Japan as one of the great traditional crafts of the North. The patterns were never invented on a whim. They flowed from nature: the curl of a fern, the eye of an animal, the scale of a fish. A skilled carver did not simply decorate the wood. He spoke through it, in a visual language his whole community could read. But the most sacred carvings of all were not trays or tools. They were slender sticks of willow, shaved so that long, delicate curls peeled back and stayed attached, like wooden ribbons. The Ainu called them inau. And they were not decoration. They were messengers. To make an inau was an act of devotion. The carver shaved the curls with slow, careful strokes, each ribbon a kind of prayer taking shape. Planted at the sacred altar, these sticks carried the words and wishes of the people up to the world of the gods. Now turn to the women's art, the needle and the thread. We have watched them weave the golden bark cloth, but it was the decoration that transformed a simple robe into something powerful. And every stitch they made was placed with deep purpose. The patterns clustered at the openings of the robe: the collar, the cuffs, the hem, the back. These were the gateways of the body, the places where, the Ainu believed, evil spirits might try to creep inside. To stitch a pattern, there was to bar the door against harm. Each shape had a name and a meaning. There was the moreau, the gentle swirl curling like a wave or a vine, said to wrap the wearer in protection. It flowed across the backs of robes, smooth and unending, a guardian made of thread. Then there was the ayushi, a bracket shape ending in a sharp point. That point was a thorn, and the thorn was an arrow, aimed outward to drive evil away. Beauty and defense, captured in a single stroke of the needle. Other shapes spoke of the natural world: the sick, an eye, watching, warding; the ram, overlapping scales like the skin of a fish. Some patterns showed the loops of a net or the curl of a fern shoot, symbols of the catch and of new life. And as with the carving, these designs were never written down. They lived in the hands and the memory of the women, passed from mother to daughter across countless generations. A girl learned her family's patterns the way she learned to speak, slowly, by heart, until they were simply part of her. So a finished robe was far more than clothing. It was a wearable shield, a coat of beauty stitched with protection, carrying the patterns of a woman's bloodline, the prayers of her hands, and the identity of her entire family. To wear it was to wear who you were. Now listen, for the Kotan was never silent. Music wove through Ainu life like smoke through the thatch. They had instruments unlike any in the south, with sounds that seemed to rise straight out of the forest and the wind. There was the tonkori, a long, slender stringed instrument, cradled against the body and plucked with the fingers. Its tones were soft and resonant, almost like a human voice humming. In skilled hands, often a woman's, it could make the whole room fall still. And there was the mukuri, a small mouth harp made of bamboo. The player held it to the lips and pulled a cord, and the reed inside buzzed and twanged. By changing the shape of the mouth, she could bend the sound, like wind in the trees or the call of a distant bird. This music was woven into everything. A soft tunkori melody to lull a baby to sleep, a buzzing mukuri to pass a long winter evening, and, when the great ceremonies came, songs to call the gods and carry the prayers of the people. Where there was music, there was dance. The Ainu called their dances rims, and many were performed in a circle, bodies moving together, voices rising in unison. To dance was not to perform. It was to belong, to become part of something larger than yourself. Many dances told stories drawn from nature. In one, dancers spread their arms and stepped slowly, becoming graceful cranes lifting into flight. In others, they mimicked the swing of a hunter's bow or the sway of the trees. Through their bodies, the Ainu became the world around them. But of all their treasures, perhaps the greatest was the one you could not see or touch at all. It was the spoken word, the vast library of stories the Ainu carried entirely in memory and passed on by voice alone. The grandest of these were the yukar, long, heroic epics, chanted aloud. They could go on for hours, even through an entire night, the reciter's voice rising and falling in a steady, hypnotic rhythm while listeners marked the beat with light taps. These were not idle tales. They held the history of the people, the deeds of ancient heroes, the doings of the gods, and the story of how the world itself began. A single yukar might preserve knowledge that elsewhere would fill 100 books. But think of the fragility of such a treasure. It lived only in memory. If the last person who knew a particular song should die before passing it on, then that song, and everything it carried, would vanish from the world forever. The Ainu library could burn one voice at a time. And now we return at last to the most personal art of all, the one carried not on wood or cloth, but on the body itself. The tattoo. For Ainu women, it was the deepest mark of who they were. The tools were knife-like, their handles often beautifully carved. In the oldest days, a razor-sharp sliver of obsidian was used, bound with fiber so that only the very tip could pierce the skin. This was no careless marking. It was an exacting, sacred craft. The method was slow and painful. Fine cuts were made in the skin around the lips. The blood was wiped away with cloth soaked in an antiseptic of wood ash. Then soot, gathered with the fingers from the bottom of a kettle, was rubbed deep into the cuts, staining them a permanent blue-black. It began when a girl was still a child, a small mark on the upper lip, and was widened, year by year, until it was completed near the time of her marriage. Each session was an ordeal of patience and pain, endured as a passage from girlhood into womanhood, and through the pain, the tattooist sang. A gentle chant, woven into the work, that told the girl she was beautiful, that the marks around her lips were brilliant, a wonder to behold. The song was a comfort and a kind of magic, binding the soot into the skin and the strength into the soul. For this was never mere decoration. The tattoo marked a woman as an adult, ready for marriage. It protected her from evil spirits, and it prepared her, the Ainu believed, for the journey after death. For without her marks, a woman's soul might not find its way home to her ancestors. And here we find the single thread that ties all of it together: the carving, the embroidery, the music, the songs, and the ink. For the Ainu, beauty itself was protective. A thing made beautiful was a thing made safe. A pattern was a prayer. An ornament was a guardian. To carve a perfect curl, to stitch a flawless swirl, to chant an epic without a single error, to bear the tattoo with grace. These were not luxuries or pastimes. They were how the Ainu kept the darkness out, honored the gods, and held their identity intact, generation after generation. This was a culture in which art was not separate from life. It was life, woven into every robe, carved into every tray, sung into every long winter night, and worn upon the very faces of its women. A whole civilization, expressed without a single written word. To truly know the Ainu, you must step into a world you cannot see. A world layered invisibly over our own, crowded with presence and power. For the Ainu, the universe was not empty matter. It was alive, utterly, completely alive, with gods. They had a word for these beings, Kamui. It is often translated as God, but it meant something richer than that. A Kamui was a spirit, a divine presence, and the Ainu believed they were everywhere, in everything, all the time. The fire in the hearth was a god. The river was a god. The mountains, the wind, the bear, the owl, each held a spirit. Even a humble tool, a knife or a pot, could carry a Kamui within it. Nothing in the Ainu world was truly lifeless. Here was the beautiful idea at the center of it all. The Ainu believed that these gods did not naturally look like fire, or bears, or rivers. In their own realm, the Kamui looked much like people. They only put on these earthly disguises in order to visit the human world. And so every animal, every fire, every gift of nature was really a visiting god, wearing a costume, which meant a creature taken in the hunt was not merely killed. It was a guest who had come to give the Ainu its body, and who must in return be honored and sent home with thanks. The most beloved god of all lived in every home. She was Kamui Fuchi, the grandmother of the fire, the goddess of the hearth. Of all the Kamui, she was the closest, the most constant. She lived at the very center of the house, in the flames that never died. She was no distant deity. She watched over the family day and night. The Ainu believed she gave the souls of newborn children, and that she received the souls of the dead, guiding them onward. Her fire was a gateway between this world and the next, which is why it could never be allowed to go out. Beyond the home dwelt the great gods of the wild, the owl, watching silently over the village in the dark, the killer whale, lord of the cold seas, and, greatest of the land gods, the master of the mountains, Kim-un Kamui. He ruled the high forests, and he came down to the people in the body of the bear. So when a bear gave its body to the Ainu, it was the mountain god himself, come to visit, bringing the gift of meat and warm fur. There could be no greater honor and no greater responsibility, and the Ainu marked the place where they thanked their gods with a sacred altar. That altar stood just east of the house, beyond the sacred window. Its fence was lined with the curling Inao prayer sticks, and along it rested the skulls of bears honored in years past. Each skull was not a trophy. It was a record, proof that a god had been welcomed, thanked, and sent home with love. This brings us to the most extraordinary ceremony in all of Ainu life. A ritual of love and sorrow so striking that, once understood, it never leaves you. The Ainu called it Iomante, the sending home of the bear. It began, strangely, with a hunt in the mountains. When hunters found a mother bear with a young cub, they would take the mother, but the tiny cub they carried home alive, cradled in their arms, back to the village. And there, something tender and astonishing happened. The cub was raised as a member of the family. It was fed by hand. It was played with. Some women even nursed the youngest cubs at their own breast. For a year, sometimes two, the bear lived among them as one of their own children. The bond was real. The children loved the cub. The family fed it the best of their food. It grew strong and trusting in their care. And yet, all the while, the Ainu held a quiet, aching knowledge in their hearts about what this beloved creature truly was. For they believed this was no ordinary animal. It was the mountain god, a divine guest, who had taken this form to live among them for a time. And a guest, no matter how dearly loved, cannot stay forever. The day would come when the god must be sent home. When that time arrived, usually in the depths of winter, the whole village prepared for days. Neighbors were invited from far away. The finest robes were brought out. Food was cooked, sake was readied, and the Inao prayer sticks were carved fresh. This was the greatest event a Kotan would ever hold. When the ceremony began, the people gathered around. There were prayers and songs and dances offered to honor the bear god. The elders spoke to the animal directly, thanking it for the time it had spent among them, telling it that the moment had come to return to its true home. And here lay the heartbreak at the center of it all. The very people who had raised the bear, who had fed it and loved it, now wept openly. For the ritual would end the bear's earthly life, freeing its spirit to journey back to the world of the gods. They grieved, even as they believed they were giving it the greatest gift of all. The sending itself was done with the utmost solemnity and care. The bear's spirit released to begin its long journey home. We need not dwell on its details. What matters is the meaning the Ainu gave it, not an act of cruelty, but an act of profound love and faith. For they believed the bear's spirit, having been treated with such kindness, would return to the mountain gods and tell them of the Ainu's love. And pleased by this, the gods would send more bears, more salmon, more bounty in the years to come. Kindness to the guest ensured the survival of the host, so the spirit was not sent away empty-handed. It was loaded with gifts, beautifully carved inao, bundles of dried fish, fine offerings, so that it would arrive home wealthy and honored among the gods, with stories to tell of the generous people who had cared for it. Afterward, the bear's skull was placed with honor upon the Nusasan altar, joining the others gathered there over the years, and the meat was shared among everyone in the village, the god's final generous gift, sustaining the people through the hardest stretch of winter. Why would a people do such a thing? Raise a creature with love, only to send it away in sorrow? The answer lies in how the Ainu understood death itself, for they did not believe death was an ending. They believed it was only a door. The same belief held for people too. When a person died, their soul did not simply vanish. Guided by Kamui Fuchi through the gateway of her fire, it journeyed onward to the land of the dead. A place much like this one, where the ancestors waited to welcome it home. This was the great secret at the heart of the Ainu world. Nothing truly dies. The bear goes home to the mountain. The salmon returns to the river of the gods. The grandmother passes through the fire to her ancestors. Everything is only changing form, only going home. To live among the Ainu was to live, always, as a grateful guest in a world full of gods. Every culture has its customs that to an outsider seem strange, even impossible to understand. The Ainu had many, but look closer, and you find that none of them were random. Each one made perfect sense inside their world, where the practical and the sacred were never truly separate. Consider one of their most curious objects, a flat, carved wooden stick that no Ainu feast was without. Westerners who first saw it gave it a strange nickname, the mustache lifter, but its true purpose was far more sacred than that. This was the ikupasui, the prayer stick used to speak with the gods. When a man drank ceremonial sake, he would first dip the stick into the cup and flick droplets toward the fire, an offering to the Kamui. Only then would he drink himself. The gods always tasted first. And the nickname? The Ainu men wore such great, full beards that the stick was also handy for holding the whiskers clear of the cup as they drank. A sacred tool and a practical one, all in a single carved piece of wood. That was the Ainu way exactly, the holy and the everyday, woven together. Then there was their clothing made from fish. We have glimpsed it already. But pause to consider how remarkable it truly was. The Ainu took the skin of the salmon and transformed it into garments and boots, light and supple and surprisingly tough. The skins were carefully cleaned, dried, and softened until they became a kind of pale, water-resistant leather, perfect for the snow and the wet. To pull on a pair of salmon skin boots was, quite literally, to walk through winter wearing the river itself. But some of their most striking customs surrounded death. When a person died, the Ainu did not always keep their home. In some communities, the house of the dead was burned to the ground, or abandoned entirely. The family would move on and build anew. Why give up a home built with such labor? Because to the Ainu, the dwelling itself had a spirit. Burning it sent the house along with its owner into the next world, so that the departed would not arrive empty-handed, and the living would not linger where death had touched. The same logic shaped their graves. The possessions of the dead were buried with them, but first, they were deliberately broken. A bowl cracked, a tool snapped. For the Ainu believed that breaking an object released its spirit, freeing it to travel onward and serve its owner in the world to come. And here is perhaps the most touching custom of all. The Ainu feared that evil spirits, the bringers of sickness, preyed especially on beloved children. So to protect a treasured infant, they gave it a deliberately ugly, worthless-sounding name. A name no demon would bother to steal. Only later, when the child had safely grown, would it receive a true and proper name. It was a parent's clever trick, born of love and fear in a world they believed was crowded with unseen dangers, a world where naming a thing could draw the wrong attention. When sickness did strike, the Ainu turned to a special figure, the shaman, often a woman, who could reach the world of spirits. Entering a trance, she would commune with the Kamui to discover what had caused the illness and how the balance might be restored. Dreams, too, were taken seriously, seen not as idle fancy, but as messages from the gods, carrying warnings, guidance, or visions of things to come. A vivid dream might change a family's plans or send a hunter to a particular valley. The spirit world was always speaking, if one knew how to listen. Even their instruments had souls. Inside the body of the tonkori, the Ainu would place a single small bead, a stone heart, they believed, that gave the instrument its spirit and its voice. When it was played, it was not just wood and string singing. It was a living thing. Add to all this the customs we have already met. The secret woven girdles guarded between women, the soot tattoos sung into a girl's skin, a bear cub raised as a child, and wept over as a god. Strange, every one of them to an outsider's eye. For centuries, visitors from the south and from the west looked at these practices and called them primitive, even savage. They could not see the logic beneath the surface. They saw only the strangeness, and missed entirely the wisdom holding it all together. But there was no savagery here. There was only a different, complete way of seeing the world, where a fish became a coat, a broken bowl freed a spirit, an ugly name shielded a child, and a beloved bear became a god going home. Nothing wasted, nothing meaningless. Everything connected. And that, perhaps, was the rarest thing about the Ainu. Not any single custom, but the seamless wholeness of all of them. A world view without a single crack in it, in which everything had its spirit, its meaning, and its place. A way of living the modern world would very nearly destroy. For thousands of years, the Ainu world had turned by its own rhythms. But in the year 1868, a new Japan was born. Modern, hungry, and determined to unite every corner of its territory under one flag and one identity. And the Ainu lay directly in its path. Their homeland was renamed Hokkaido and claimed for the new nation. Settlers poured in from the south by the thousands. The forests and rivers the Ainu had tended for countless generations were carved up, fenced off, and handed to newcomers. The land was no longer theirs. Then came the bans, one after another. Salmon fishing, the very heart of Ainu survival, was outlawed in their own rivers. The divine fish, the Kamui Chep, was suddenly forbidden to the people who had honored it for millennia. The deer hunts were restricted. The poison arrow craft fell silent. And in the schools, Ainu children were forbidden to speak their own language, the unwritten tongue that held all their songs and stories. A child caught speaking it was punished. Generation by generation the words began to slip away. The tattoos were banned. The Great Bear ceremony was forbidden. One by one the threads that had held the Ainu world together were cut. And in 1899 a law was passed whose very name revealed everything. It called them, the former Aborigines, as if they were already gone. To survive, many Ainu did the only thing they could. They hid. They put away the robes. They let the tattoos fade from memory. They learned to speak only Japanese, to dress like their neighbors, to bury the truth of who they were. And slowly, an entire people began to vanish, not in body, but in identity. To feel what this truly meant, let us follow a single thread, one family's story, repeated in thousands of others. It begins with a grandmother, born far to the north, forced from her island home and relocated to Hokkaido by the government. In her new life, she was made to abandon the old ways, the tattoos, the ceremonies, the customs of her ancestors. They had become things to be ashamed of, things that marked her as different and unwelcome. So she let them go, swallowed her past, and tried simply to survive. And so her children, and her children's children, grew up not knowing. The heritage was buried so deeply that it disappeared even from within the family. There were grandchildren who reached adulthood having no idea they were Ainu at all. There is one quiet, heartbreaking detail in this family's story. A woman remembered a soup her family always made when she was young. A fish soup, warm and simple, a fixture of her childhood. Only as an adult did she learn the truth. It was oha, the ancient soup of the Ainu, and no one had ever told her. Think of what that small moment holds. A heritage so hidden that a woman could eat its food her entire life and never know its name. Now multiply that ache by thousands of families. This was the true cost of erasure, not just lost land, but a people made strangers to themselves. And the language came perilously close to dying altogether. With each elder who passed, more of the words, more of the songs, more of the yukar were lost forever. By the late 20th century, only a tiny handful of people could still speak fluent Ainu. The library was nearly empty. But here, at the darkest point, the story turns. For there were those who refused to let their people simply disappear. Quietly, stubbornly, they began to gather up the pieces of a culture on the very edge of being lost. One man stood out among them. Kayano Shigeru spent his life collecting the handicrafts, recording the language onto tape, and saving the words of the elders before they were gone. He built a museum in his home village to hold what he had saved. He became a guardian of a vanishing world. And he did something no Ainu had done before. He won a seat in Japan's national parliament, and there, in the highest chamber of the country that had tried to erase his people, he rose and spoke aloud in the Ainu language. After a century of silence, the words were heard again, in the heart of power itself. He was not alone. Through the 1970s and beyond, a growing movement of Ainu began to reclaim their story, writing their own history, reviving their ceremonies, and demanding to be recognized at last. The shame their grandparents had carried began, slowly, to turn into pride. Their efforts bore fruit. In 1997, that shameful old law was finally struck down and replaced by one meant to promote and protect Ainu culture. And then, in 2019, came the moment generations had waited for. Japan officially recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people of the land. Today, on the shore of a quiet lake in Hokkaido, stands a national museum and park devoted entirely to the Ainu, a place where the language is taught, the dances performed, the crafts kept alive. A culture once marked for extinction now has a home built in its honor. And a new generation is taking up the work. Young Ainu are learning the words their grandparents were forbidden to speak. They are taking up the needle, stitching the old protective patterns once more. They are singing the yukar, plucking the tonkori, reclaiming a heritage that was very nearly stolen from them. And that woman, the one who ate her ancestors' soup without knowing its name? Today, people like her no longer hide. They serve that very soup with pride, teaching others its name, its history, its meaning. What was once buried in shame is now shared as a gift. The fire, banked for so long, is beginning to rise again. We began beside an old woman in a fire. Let us end there too, because in homes across Hokkaido today, the fire still burns. The hearth that the Ainu called a goddess has not gone cold. After everything, the wars, the bans, the long silence, it endures. We have traveled through an entire world together, a world of elm bark robes and salmon soup, of bear gods and prayer sticks, of tattooed faces and epic songs sung through the long winter nights. A world that was very nearly erased from the earth, and chose instead to remember itself. What can such a people teach us, here and now? Perhaps this. The Ainu did not see the world as a thing to be used, a storehouse to be emptied. They saw it as family. The fire was a grandmother. The bear was a guest. The river was a giver of gifts. And because the world was family, it was owed respect. Gratitude before every meal. Thanks for every life taken. Nothing wasted. Nothing taken for granted. In an age that so often forgets these things, the Ainu offer a quiet, ancient reminder of how else we might live upon the earth. They were told to vanish. Their language was banned, their ceremonies forbidden, their very name written down as something already past. And yet, here they are, speaking again, stitching again, singing again. A people who were ordered to forget and answered by refusing. At the heart of it all was one belief, the most beautiful perhaps that they carried, that nothing truly dies. The bear's spirit returns to the mountain. The salmon goes home to the river of the gods. The soul of the grandmother passes through the fire to her waiting ancestors. If that is true, then the Ainu themselves were never truly lost. They were only waiting, only resting, like the fire banked low against the cold. And now, in the hands of a new generation, that fire is rising once more, catching, brightening, throwing its warmth into the future. So the next time you sit beside a fire, or watch a river run, or share a simple bowl of soup with the people you love, remember the Ainu. Remember a people who looked at all of it and saw not things, but gods. Not resources, but relatives. The people of the Kamui, the people of the gods, nearly erased, never extinguished. Their fire still burns in the north, and as long as it does, nothing of theirs is ever truly gone. It has only, for a little while, gone home.